The carriage door slammed shut before Claire could argue, and the lock clicked from the outside. She pounded on the window with both fists. Nobody came. The horses were already moving, and the house she had grown up in was already shrinking behind her, swallowed by fog and distance. Her father had signed the papers 3 days ago. He had not asked her opinion. He had not even looked at her while he did it. He had simply set down the pen, poured himself a drink, and told her that the Duke of Cairnmore had agreed to clear every debt the family owed in exchange for one thing.
Sorry.
Claire pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched the fields blur past. She was 22 years old, and in less than 2 hours she would be married to a man she had never met, a man people only ever described in the same 3 words. The wheelchair Duke. Nobody in the village spoke of him without lowering their voice first, as if his name itself might carry something contagious. Some said he had lost the use of his legs in a hunting accident. Others said it was a carriage crash, much like the one she was sitting in now, which she found darkly funny in a way she did not have the energy to explain to herself. What she did know was simple: he was rich, he was untouchable, and in 2 hours he would be her husband. The carriage slowed as it turned through a set of iron gates taller than any door she had ever walked through. Cairnmore Manor rose out of the mist like something built to be looked at from a distance and never approached. Every window was lit, and yet the house felt empty, the way a stage feels empty even with an audience watching. A footman opened her door and offered a gloved hand. She did not take it. She stepped down on her own, smoothed the front of her traveling dress, and reminded herself that fear was not useful right now. Fear did not pay debts. Fear did not save her father's land or her younger brother's future. Only this marriage did that. She walked into the entrance hall with her chin raised, and her hands shaking behind her back where nobody could see them. The hall was enormous, lined with paintings of Ashworth ancestors who all seemed to be staring directly at her with the same unimpressed expression. At the far end, near a roaring fireplace, sat a wheelchair. And in it a man. He did not rise, obviously. He simply watched her cross the entire length of the hall, unhurried, his eyes tracking her the way a hawk tracks something it has already decided is not a threat. He was younger than she expected, maybe 28, dark hair pushed back from a face that gave away absolutely nothing, and shoulders that seemed strangely broad for a man who supposedly could not stand. A blanket sat folded over his knees, untouched, more decoration than necessity. "You must be Claire," he said. His voice was calm, almost bored, like he was greeting a guest for tea rather than the woman he was about to marry. "I must be," she said. Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite a smile. "Well," he said, "at least you're honest about not wanting to be here. Should I lie to you instead?" "No," he said, "I get enough of that from everyone else in this house." A woman in a gray dress appeared at his side, older, with sharp eyes and a mouth that looked permanently pressed into a line of disapproval. She introduced herself as Margaret, the housekeeper, and informed Claire that the ceremony would take place within the hour, in the chapel behind the west wing, and that a maid would help her dress. Claire barely heard the details. She was still looking at Julian, Duke of Cairnmore, trying to read something true in a face built entirely out of careful stillness. "You're starring," he said. "You're strange," she said back before she could stop herself. He actually laughed at that, short and surprised, like the sound had escaped before he gave it permission. "Careful," he said. "People don't usually say that to my face." "I'm not people," Claire said. "I'm apparently your wife." The maid arrived before he could respond, and Claire was pulled away up a wide staircase, leaving the Duke watching her from his chair with an expression she could not name and did not trust. The dress they had prepared for her was pale gold, heavier than anything she had worn before, stitched with thread that caught the candlelight every time she moved. The maid, a quiet girl named Iris, laced the back of it with quick, careful fingers, and refused to meet Claire's eyes in the mirror. "Is something wrong with the Duke?" Claire finally asked. Iris's hands paused for exactly 1 second on the laces. "No, my lady," she said, "nothing wrong at all." The pause said more than the words did. Claire studied her own reflection while Iris finished dressing her, gold fabric pooling at her feet, her hair pinned up in a style she had never worn in her life. She looked like someone else entirely, someone who belonged in a house like this. She did not feel like that person at all. The chapel was small and candlelit, and the ceremony itself moved fast, faster than any wedding she had imagined as a child. There was no music, no guests beyond a handful of staff standing near the walls. Her father did not come. He had sent his signature and nothing else. Julian was wheeled to the front by the same silent footman who had opened her carriage door. He wore black, and against it his face looked paler than it had by the fireplace, though his eyes stayed just as unreadable. The priest spoke quickly. Claire repeated words she barely processed. When it came time for Julian's vows, his voice did not shake at all, steady and low, like a man reciting something he had memorized long before this exact night. When the priest pronounced them married, nobody clapped, nobody smiled. The candles flickered as if even the room itself was holding its breath. Julian looked up at her for the first time since the vows had started. "Welcome to Cairnmore," he said quietly, only for her. "I hope you're better at surviving here than you look." "I'm better at surviving than I look," Claire said, "in most places." Something passed between them then, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it. The wedding dinner was long and stiff, a table set for two people who were now legally bound and knew nothing real about each other. Margaret hovered near the doorway the entire meal, watching Claire with an attention that felt less like hospitality and more like surveillance. Claire noticed small things throughout the meal. A guard positioned outside the dining room door, standing far too straight for a house this quiet. Another guard near the base of the staircase. A third somewhere past the far hallway, glimpsed only for a second before he stepped out of sight. "Why so many guards for one duke in a wheelchair?" Claire asked, keeping her tone light, testing. Julian's fork paused over his plate for exactly a heartbeat. "Old habits," he said. "My father kept a large staff. I've never seen the need to change it." It was a smooth answer. Too smooth. Claire had grown up around men who lied for a living, debt collectors and creditors, and her own father when the drink was in him, and she recognized the particular ease of a lie that had been told many times before. She let it go for now. After dinner, a servant led her to a bedroom on the second floor, far from what she assumed were the Duke's own quarters. The room was beautiful, warm with firelight, a canopy bed larger than any she had slept in, windows overlooking dark gardens she could not fully see in the night. She sat on the edge of the bed once the servant left, finally alone for the first time since the carriage had locked its door hours ago. Her hands were still shaking. She pressed them flat against her knees and made herself breathe, slow and even, the way she used to when her father's temper filled the house, and she needed to disappear inside herself until it passed. A knock came at the door, soft, almost hesitant. She opened it to find Julian outside, alone, no footman pushing his chair this time. He had wheeled himself down the hallway on his own, arms working the chair with a strength that made her pause. "I wanted to check that the room suits you," he said. "It's lovely," Claire said carefully. "Thank you." He studied her for a long moment, the firelight from her room catching half his face and leaving the other half in shadow. "You don't trust me," he said, not a question. "I don't know you," Claire answered. "That's different from not trusting you. Give me time and I'm sure I'll manage both." That surprised a real laugh out of him again, quiet, genuine. "Fair," he said. "Good night, Claire." "Good night, Julian." He turned the chair and wheeled himself back down the hallway, and Claire watched him go, noting again how easily his arms moved, how little strain showed in his shoulders for a man who supposedly had not walked in years. She closed the door and leaned against it, staring into the fire without really seeing it. Something about this house did not add up, and Claire had spent her whole life being the one person in every room clever enough to notice what others missed. She was not about to stop tonight, on her wedding night, in a house full of guards protecting a man who could not stand. She changed out of the heavy gold dress and into a simple nightgown, blew out the candles, and lay in the enormous bed listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Footsteps in distant hallways, a door closing somewhere below, the low murmur of voices she could not make out. Sleep did not come easily. Somewhere past midnight, she heard something that made her sit straight up in bed. Footsteps. Steady, even, unhurried footsteps, moving down the hallway just outside her door, and then fading toward the far end of the house. Claire sat frozen in the dark, listening to her own heartbeat, telling herself it was a servant, a guard, anyone at all. But something in her, the same something that had noticed the guards and the too smooth answers and the strong arms working a wheelchair with ease, refused to believe it. She had been married for less than 6 hours, and already the walls of Cairnmore Manor were whispering secrets she had not yet earned the right to hear. Claire lay back down, eyes open in the darkness, and made herself a quiet promise before sleep finally took her. Whatever this house was hiding, she intended to find out. Claire woke before dawn with her heart already racing, though she could not remember what she had been dreaming. She lay still for a moment, listening. The house was quiet now, the strange footsteps from the night before gone, replaced by the ordinary creak of an old building settling into morning. She told herself the footsteps had belonged to a guard, nothing more. She almost believed it. A knock came at her door just as the sun cleared the hills outside her window. Iris entered with a tray of tea and a folded note, her eyes down as always. "His Grace requests your company for breakfast," Iris said, "in the small dining room whenever you're ready." Claire dressed quickly, choosing a simple blue morning dress instead of anything grand, and made her way downstairs. The manor looked different in daylight, less like a stage and more like an actual house, though the guards were still there, standing at posts that made no obvious sense for protecting a man confined to a chair. Julian was already at the table when she arrived, a cup of coffee in front of him, a stack of papers pushed to one side. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression eased slightly, as if he had been unsure whether she would come at all. "Good morning," he said. "I half expected you to have the staff smuggle you out through the kitchens by now." "Give me time," Claire said, taking the seat across from him. "I'm still learning the layout. I could have someone draw you a map." "I'd prefer to learn it myself," she said. "Maps only show you what someone else wants you to see." He studied her over the rim of his coffee cup, and for a moment she thought she saw real amusement there, sharp and quick, before it folded back into his usual calm. "You're going to be trouble," he said. "I sincerely hope so," Claire answered, and reached for the teapot before he could see her smile. Breakfast passed easier than she expected. Julian was clever in a dry, understated way, quick, with a joke that landed before she saw it coming, and Claire found herself laughing twice before she caught herself and pulled the laughter back in. She had not planned on finding him funny. She had not planned on finding him anything at all beyond the arrangement her father had forced upon her. But underneath every joke, every easy exchange, she kept noticing the same small wrongness that had bothered her the night before. His forearms, visible where his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, were solid, corded with muscle in a way that did not match years spent sitting still. His grip on his coffee cup was firm, precise, nothing like the tremor she might have expected from long-term weakness. She said nothing about it, not yet. After breakfast, Julian excused himself to deal with estate matters, and Claire found herself with an entire unfamiliar house and nothing to fill the hours. She decided to explore. The manor was larger than she had realized the night before, hallway after hallway branching off into rooms she had no names for, portraits of long-dead Ashworths lining every wall like an audience that never blinked. She walked slowly, taking note of everything, the way she used to map her father's moods before a storm hit. She found the library first, tall shelves stretching to a ceiling painted with faded clouds, and spent a pleasant half-hour running her fingers along spines before continuing her search. She found a music room, silent and dust-free despite clearly being unused. She found a long gallery of windows overlooking gardens that, in daylight, were far more beautiful than the shadowed version she had glimpsed the night before. And then, near the end of a hallway on the ground floor, she found a door that was different from every other door in the house. It was thick, reinforced with iron bands, and locked with two separate mechanisms rather than the simple latches used everywhere else. There was no plaque, no decoration, nothing to suggest what lay behind it beyond the sheer effort someone had gone through to keep it sealed. Claire pressed her palm flat against the wood, as if she might feel something through it, some clue to what was being protected, or hidden, or both. That room is not for guests. She turned quickly. Margaret stood a few feet behind her, arms folded, her expression unreadable in the way that seemed to run in every member of this household, master and staff alike. "I wasn't aware there were rules about which hallways I'm allowed to walk down," Claire said, keeping her voice light despite the sudden thud of her pulse. "There aren't," Margaret said, "only about which doors you open." "I didn't open it." "No," Margaret agreed, "you didn't." The housekeeper's eyes held hers for a long moment, something almost like a warning passing between them, before she turned and walked away without another word, her footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Claire stood alone outside the locked door for a while longer, her curiosity now sharpened into something closer to determination. Whatever was behind that door, someone in this house considered it worth guarding as carefully as they guarded the Duke himself. She spent the rest of the day trying not to think about it, and failing. Dinner that evening was less stiff than the wedding meal had been. Julian seemed to have decided, somewhere over the course of the day, that conversation with his new wife was not an unpleasant chore, and Claire found the hours passing easier than she expected. They argued lightly over a book he claimed she would hate and she insisted she would love. They traded small stories about childhood, hers full of debt collectors and a father who drank too much, his carefully edited, full of gaps she noticed but did not push. "You skip over things," she said at one point, watching him closely. "So do you," he said. "I skip over things because they're painful." "So do I," he said, and something in his voice closed the subject entirely. Claire let it drop, filing the moment away with everything else she was collecting. The locked door, the guards, the strong arms, the steady footsteps in the night, pieces of a puzzle she had not yet earned enough trust to see completed. That night, after the candles had been blown out and the house had gone quiet again, Claire lay awake deliberately this time, waiting. She did not have to wait long. Just past midnight, the same even footsteps returned, moving down the hallway outside her door. Slow, careful, deliberate, nothing like the shuffle of a servant carrying a late tray or the uneven gait of someone unfamiliar with the house in darkness. This time, Claire did not stay in bed. She slipped out from under the covers, pulled a shawl over her nightgown, and crossed to the door as quietly as she could manage. She pressed her ear against the wood first, listening as the footsteps continued past her room and further down the hall, fatting toward the direction of the locked door she had found earlier that day. Her hand found the door handle before her mind had fully decided to move. She opened it slowly, carefully, wincing at every small creak of the hinges, and stepped out into a hallway lit only by the faint glow of a few low-burning wall lamps. The footsteps were further away now, but still audible, still moving with that same unhurried confidence. Claire followed them. She kept close to the wall, her bare feet silent against the cold stone floor, her heart pounding loud enough that she was certain it would give her away before her footsteps ever could. The hallway stretched longer than she remembered from her earlier exploration, shadows pooling in corners the wall lamps could not reach. Ahead of her, just barely visible around the curve of the corridor, she caught a glimpse of a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with an easy, confident stride that belonged to a man in full command of his own body. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The figure turned a corner and disappeared from view before she could see his face clearly, but something about the shape of him, the set of his shoulders, the particular way he carried himself, felt unbearably familiar. She pressed forward, rounding the same corner only seconds later, just in time to see the tail end of a dark coat disappearing through a doorway at the very end of the hall. The locked door. Except it was not locked now. It stood slightly open, light spilling out in a thin gold line across the stone floor, and the sound of the two heavy mechanisms had been undone from the inside. Claire crept closer, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, and every ounce of her curiosity refusing to listen. She reached the doorway and pressed herself against the wall beside it, close enough now to hear low voices from within, though she could not make out the words. One voice she did not recognize at all, older, rougher, unfamiliar to the house. The other voice was quieter, steadier, and horribly, impossibly familiar. Julian's voice. Claire's mind raced through every possible explanation, refusing every single one of them. She leaned forward, just enough to see through the narrow gap of the open door, and what she saw stopped her breath entirely. Julian stood in the center of the room. Not sat, stood. On both legs, steady and unaided, no chair anywhere in sight, speaking quietly to a man she had never seen before in her life. Claire's hand flew to her mouth to stop the sound that wanted to escape her, and in doing so, her elbow caught the edge of a small table just outside the door, sending a decorative vase crashing to the stone floor with a sound that seemed to shatter the entire silent house at once. Both voices inside the room stopped instantly. Claire did not wait to see what happened next. She turned and ran, bare feet slapping against cold stone, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, back down the hallway, around the corner, through her own door, which she shut and locked with shaking hands before pressing her back against it and sliding down to the floor. Outside she heard nothing at first, no footsteps, no voices. And then, faint but unmistakable, she heard the sound of someone walking, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside her door. A long pause. Then the footsteps retreated, back down the hallway, unhurried, as if whoever it was had decided for now that whatever Claire had seen could wait until morning. Claire sat on the floor of her room for a long time after the footsteps faded, staring at nothing, replaying the image over and over in her mind. Julian standing. Julian walking, without pain, without effort, like a man who had never once needed that chair at all. Whatever secret Cairnmore Manor had been hiding, Claire had just found the very edge of it, and she had the terrible feeling that the rest of it was far larger and far more dangerous than anything she had imagined on the night she was forced to marry a man everyone called the Wheelchair Duke. Morning came, and Claire had not slept. She sat by her window through the last hours of darkness, watching the sky turn from black to gray to a pale, uncertain blue, running through everything she had seen the night before until the images stopped making sense from repetition alone. A knock came at her door not long after sunrise, sharper than Iris's usual soft tap. Claire opened it to find Julian himself standing in the hallway. Standing. No chair, no blanket over his knees, just a tall, broad-shouldered man in a plain white shirt, leaning one shoulder casually against her doorframe as if he had never once needed anything else to hold his weight. "May I come in?" he said. "Or would you rather scream first and get it out of the way?" Claire stepped back to let him pass, too stunned to manage a clever answer. He walked into her room, closed the door behind him, and turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the morning light. "You're not paralyzed," Claire said. It was not a question. "No," he said. "You've never been paralyzed." "Once," he said. "For about 6 months, a long time ago. A riding accident, if you're curious, though not the one the household staff have been told to describe. And after that I recovered." He said it simply, without any pride in the fact, and I decided it was safer if very few people knew it. Claire felt something between fury and disbelief rising in her chest, competing for control of her voice. "You let an entire household believe you were disabled. You let me marry you believing it." "Yes," Julian said, "I did." "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her the way he had studied her across the dinner table the night before, as if trying to decide how much weight she could carry. "Because 3 men have tried to kill me in the last 2 years," he said. "Poisoned twice. A knife once, very nearly successful. Each time whoever arranged it believed they were removing a threat. A duke who can command men, ride, fight, defend his own house. So I stopped being that duke. In public, at least." Claire's anger faltered slightly under the weight of that. "A broken man is not worth killing," Julian continued. "A broken man cannot lead an uprising, cannot command loyalty, cannot threaten anyone's plans, so I became one. The chair, the blanket, the careful, tired voice I use in front of anyone outside this house. It has kept me alive for 2 years when nothing else could." "And the room," Claire said, "the locked one." "A place where I can be exactly what I actually am," he said. "Where the men I trust can speak to me as their duke, not as an invalid they're humoring. Last night, that was one of my father's oldest allies, a man named Griggs. We were discussing something that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with keeping this house standing." Claire crossed her arms, still shaking slightly from exhaustion and the strange, dizzying relief of finally understanding what she had witnessed. "You could have told me," she said. "Instead of letting me believe I'd married a stranger with something dangerously wrong hidden underneath him." "I could have," Julian agreed. "But you've been my wife for exactly 1 day, Claire. I don't hand my life over to strangers, no matter what a piece of paper says about our arrangement." "And now," he said, "you already know, which means I no longer have a choice." Something in the way he said it settled over Claire like a weight, heavier than she expected. This was not simply a secret she had stumbled into. It was a burden, and by seeing it, she had inherited some portion of the danger that came attached to it. "Who wants you dead?" she asked, specifically. Julian's jaw tightened, the first crack in his composed exterior since he had walked into her room. "My father had a younger brother," he said. "My uncle Edmund. When my father died, the title passed to me as it should have. Edmund believed it should have passed to him, or failed that to his own son after him. He has spent the last 2 years trying to correct what he considers an unfair inheritance." "By killing you." "By killing me," Julian confirmed. Quietly, carefully, in ways that would look like accident or illness rather than murder so that no one could ever prove his involvement. Claire sank down onto the edge of her bed, the enormity of it settling over her slowly. "And my marrying you," she said, "does that change anything for him?" "It might," Julian said. "A duke who takes a wife is a duke planning for an heir. Edmund's claim only holds weight while I remain childless. If we have children, his path to the title closes permanently, no matter what happens to me." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but perfectly clear. "So I'm not just your wife," Claire said slowly. "I'm a threat to him too, the moment I walk through those gates." "Yes," Julian said quietly. "I'm sorry for that. I should have told you before the ceremony, not after." Claire looked at him for a long moment, This man who had lied to an entire household for 2 years to survive, who had just handed her the truth not because he wanted to, but because circumstances had forced his hand. "Why tell me now?" she said. "You could have kept lying, I might not have pushed further." "You would have," Julian said, and for the first time since she had met him, something like a genuine smile crossed his face. "I watched you find that locked door on your first full day in this house. You were never going to let it go." Claire almost laughed despite everything, the sound catching somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now," Julian said, "I need you to understand something important. From this point on, the chair stays exactly as it was in front of everyone outside a very small circle of people I trust completely. Margaret knows. Griggs knows. A handful of guards know. No one else. Not the staff who serve our meals, not the maids who dress you, not any visitor who comes through those gates. Can you do that? Pretend my husband can't walk in front of an entire household indefinitely." "Yes." Claire considered it, turning the request over in her mind, weighing the exhaustion of maintaining such a lie against the alternative, which apparently involved a man actively trying to have his own nephew murdered. "I can do that," she said finally, "but I want more than silence in exchange. I want to know everything. Every guard, every plan, every piece of this you've been carrying alone. If I'm inside the danger now, I refuse to be inside it blind." Julian studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, surprise perhaps, or something closer to respect. "Agreed," he said. He extended his hand, an oddly formal gesture given everything that had just passed between them, and Claire took it, shaking on an arrangement stranger than any wedding vow she had spoken the day before. Over the following days, Julian kept his word. He showed her the true layout of the house's defenses, guards positioned not for show but for genuine protection, patterns that shifted every few nights to avoid predictability. He introduced her, quietly, within the locked room, to Griggs, a weathered man with sharp eyes who greeted her with far more respect than she expected once he understood she now knew the truth. He explained, piece by piece, the shape of his uncle's ambition, the allies Edmund had gathered, the slow, patient campaign of suspicious accidents that had led Julian to fake a paralysis in the first place. Claire absorbed all of it, filing details away with the same careful attention she used to give her father's moods, except now the stakes were no longer limited to a single household's finances. Now they involved lives. She also began, gradually, to see the man underneath the careful performance Julian gave to the rest of the world. In the locked room, without the blanket over his knees or the practiced weariness in his voice, he was sharper, quicker, prone to a dry humor that reminded her uncomfortably of her own. He argued strategy with Griggs the way she might have argued a point of household budgeting, precise and unwilling to concede ground without good reason. He listened when Claire offered her own opinions, which surprised her more than anything else about him. Few men in her life had ever listened to her that closely. One evening, nearly a week after the truth had come out between them, Claire found herself sitting across from Julian in the locked room, a map of the estate spread across the table between them, guard rotations marked in Griggs's careful handwriting. "Your uncle," Claire said, tracing a finger along one of the marked routes. "Does he know I've discovered the truth?" "Not yet," Julian said. "As far as anyone outside this room knows, you married a broken man and nothing more." "How long can we keep that up?" "As long as we need to," Julian said. "Longer if we're careful." Claire looked up from the map, catching his eyes across the table. "And if we're not careful enough?" Julian's expression didn't change, but something in his voice dropped lower, quieter. "Then he finds out I've been lying to him for 2 years," he said, "and he stops being patient." Outside the locked room, beyond the thick walls and the careful guards and the elaborate performance maintained for every servant in the house, the estate of Cairnmore sat quiet under a darkening sky, unaware that somewhere beyond its borders, a man with a grudge 2 years in the making was already beginning to suspect that his nephew's careful lie was starting, ever so slightly, to crack. The scream came from the east wing just after midnight, sharp and short, cut off before it could finish. Claire was awake instantly, sitting upright in bed before her mind had fully caught up to the sound. Somewhere below her window, she heard boots on gravel, more than one set, moving fast, and then a second sound, glass breaking, followed by shouting that spread through the house like fire through dry grass. She threw on a robe and was at her door within seconds, only to find it already opening from the other side. Julian stood there, fully dressed despite the hour, a lit lamp in one hand and something metal and unfamiliar tucked into his belt. "Stay behind me," he said, no trace of the tired, careful voice he used for guests. This was the other Julian, the one from the locked room, quick and sharp and entirely certain of himself. "Who is it?" Claire asked, already moving to follow him regardless of the instruction. "I don't know yet," Julian said, "but I intend to find out." They moved together down the hallway, past portraits that seemed to watch them go, the shouting growing louder as they approached the main staircase. Below them in the entrance hall, chaos had already taken hold. 2 guards lay on the ground, one groaning and clutching his shoulder, the other worryingly still. A third guard fought against a man in dark clothing near the front doors, and beyond him, through the shattered remains of a side window, more shapes were climbing into the house. "There are too many of them for this to be a simple robbery," Claire said, her voice steadier than she expected given the pounding of her own heart. "It isn't a robbery," Julian said grimly. "Edmund has decided to stop being patient." He moved down the staircase 2 steps at a time, no trace of weakness in his stride, and Claire followed close behind, gripping a heavy iron candlestick she had snatched from a hall table without entirely deciding to. The guard fighting near the front doors went down hard, and the intruder who had beaten him turned, spotting Julian at the base of the stairs. Recognition flickered across the stranger's face, followed quickly by something like triumph. "He's supposed to be in that chair," the man said, more to himself than to anyone else, as if the sight of Julian standing upright and moving freely had broken something fundamental in his understanding of the night's plan. "Disappointing, isn't it?" Julian said, and closed the distance between them before the man could fully process his surprise. What followed was fast and brutal, and over more quickly than Claire expected, Julian's movements precise and practiced in a way that made it obvious this was not the first time he had needed to defend himself with his own hands. The intruder went down hard against the stone floor and did not get back up. More shouting came from deeper in the house, and Claire realized with a jolt that the fighting was not confined to the entrance hall. Whoever Edmund had sent, they had come prepared to search the entire manor, not simply force their way through the front door. "Griggs," Julian said sharply, turning to a guard who had appeared from a side corridor, blood on his sleeve but otherwise steady on his feet. "Get every guard to the east wing. If Edmund's men are searching this house, that's where they'll look first, near my study." The guard nodded and vanished back the way he had come, shouting orders as he went. "What do we do?" Claire asked. "We survive the next 10 minutes, Julian said, "and then we make sure Edmund never gets another chance to try this." A crash sounded from the hallway leading toward the locked room, and Julian's expression shifted instantly, something close to alarm breaking through his usual composure for the first time since Claire had met him. "They know about the room," he said, already moving. Claire ran after him, her bare feet slapping against cold stone, the iron candlestick still gripped tight in one hand. They reached the hallway just in time to see 2 men attempting to force the heavy iron door, one of them wedging a crowbar into the frame while the other kept watch. Julian did not hesitate. He crossed the distance in seconds and drove his shoulder into the man with the crowbar before either intruder fully registered his presence, sending him sprawling against the stone wall. The second man turned, reaching for something at his belt. And Claire, without entirely deciding to, swung the candlestick with every ounce of strength fear and adrenaline could provide. The man crumpled, and Claire stood over him, breathing hard, staring down at what she had just done with a mixture of horror and fierce, undeniable relief that he was no longer a threat. "Remind me never to make you angry," Julian said, checking the fallen men quickly to ensure neither was in any position to continue the fight, before turning to face her properly. "I wasn't angry," Claire said, still catching her breath. "I was terrified. Apparently that works just as well." Shouting continued from elsewhere in the house, though it seemed gradually to be dying down rather than intensifying. A few minutes later, Griggs appeared at the end of the hallway, breathing hard but otherwise unharmed. "It's done," he said. "3 of them are down permanently, 2 more we've got tied and secured in the cellar. The rest fled once they realized the numbers weren't in their favor." "And the man in charge," Julian asked, "was Edmund among them?" "No," Griggs said, his expression darkening. "Too careful for that. He sent others to do his work same as always." Julian's jaw tightened, frustration flickering across his face before he pushed it down, folding it away behind the same careful control Claire had come to recognize as his default state. "Then we've bought time," he said, "not victory." Claire looked around at the wreckage of the hallway, broken glass glittering in the lamplight, blood on the stone floor, the heavy iron door of the locked room still standing thanks to how close they had come to losing it. Her hands were shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, the adrenaline draining out of her all at once and leaving something colder and more exhausted behind. "How many times has this happened before?" she asked quietly. "Before tonight." "Never like this," Julian admitted. "Poison and knives are quiet. This was loud. This was a message." "What message?" "That Edmund knows something has changed," Julian said. "That he suspects the chair is no longer protecting me the way it used to." Claire felt the weight of that settle over her, heavier than exhaustion, heavier than fear. If Edmund suspected the truth, the careful lie that had kept Julian alive for 2 years was no longer enough. Whatever safety it had provided was already cracking, and cracks, she knew from long experience with her own father's temper, only ever widened. Griggs excused himself to oversee the securing of the captured men, leaving Julian and Claire alone in the wrecked hallway, the adrenaline of the fight slowly giving way to something quieter and more uncertain between them. "You could have stayed upstairs," Julian said, "behind a locked door safe." "I could have," Claire agreed. "But apparently I married a man who runs directly toward danger instead of away from it. Someone had to keep an eye on him." Julian looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression that Claire could not entirely name, gratitude perhaps, or something warmer and less easily explained. "Thank you," he said simply, "for the candlestick if nothing else." "Any time," Claire said, and found, despite everything, that she meant it. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to creep over the horizon, and somewhere beyond the walls of Cairnmore Manor, in a house Claire had never seen and hoped never to visit, a man named Edmund was likely already receiving word that his carefully laid plan had failed, and that his nephew, the broken duke everyone believed incapable of defending himself, had proven very much capable indeed. The war between them, Claire understood now, watching Julian survey the damage to his own home with a grim, steady focus, was no longer something happening quietly in the shadows. It had just become impossible to hide. 3 days after the attack, a letter arrived at Cairnmore Manor addressed to Julian in handwriting Claire had never seen before, sealed with wax stamped in a crest she recognized from the family portraits lining the main hallway. Edmund's crest. Julian read it alone in the locked room, Claire watching his face carefully for any sign of what the letter contained. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable in the particular way she now understood meant He was working very hard to control something underneath. "He's requested a meeting," Julian said. "Here at the manor in 3 days' time. He wishes to discuss, in his words, a peaceful resolution to what he calls a misunderstanding between family." "A misunderstanding," Claire repeated flatly. "He sent armed men into your home." "Which he will deny entirely," Julian said. "He'll claim ignorance, express outrage on my behalf, and offer some quiet concession designed to buy himself time to plan something quieter and more effective." "Will you meet with him?" "I have to," Julian said. "Refusing would confirm I have something to hide. Better to let him believe the chair is still exactly what he expects it to be, and use the meeting to learn whatever I can about his next move." Claire considered this, turning the plan over the way she used to turn over her father's excuses, searching for the weak points, the places where a careful lie might crack under enough pressure. "Then I want to be in that room," she said. Julian's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Edmund has never met you. He'll be curious, certainly, but a new wife sitting quietly beside her husband raises no suspicion at all." "Good," Claire said, "because I intend to do more than sit quietly." Over the following 3 days, Julian and Griggs prepared carefully for the meeting, reinforcing the household guard under the guise of routine maintenance, positioning trusted men within easy reach of the main hall without making the arrangement obvious to an outside eye. Claire spent the time studying everything Julian could tell her about his uncle, his habits, his weaknesses, the particular pride that had driven him to believe the title should have passed to him rather than his brother's son. On the morning of the meeting, Edmund arrived exactly on time, a tall man with silver at his temples and an expression of practiced warmth that did not reach his eyes. He greeted Julian with an embrace that lasted a fraction too long, expressed shock and outrage at hearing of the attack on the manor, and turned to Claire with a smile so smooth it made her skin prickle. "And this must be the new Duchess," Edmund said, taking her hand and pressing it briefly. Julian failed to mention how lovely his wife is. "Julian tends to keep the most important things quiet," Claire said, holding his gaze without flinching. "I imagine it runs in the family." Something flickered behind Edmund's eyes, gone too quickly to fully read, before the smooth smile returned. They settled into the main drawing room, Julian positioned carefully in his chair, the blanket over his knees, his voice pitched into the tired, careful register he used for every audience outside the locked room. Claire sat beside him, watching Edmund with the same quiet attention she used to give her father, cataloging every small tell, every place where his composure slipped even slightly. "I want you to know," Edmund said, settling into a chair across from them, "that whoever committed this terrible act will answer for it. I've already begun making inquiries among my own contacts." "How thoughtful," Julian said, his tone carefully bland. "Though I confess I've made a few inquiries of my own." "Have you?" Edmund said, something tightening almost imperceptibly around his eyes. "And what have you found?" "Very little so far," Julian said. "The men who attacked us were careful not to identify themselves, professional in their way. Someone paid well for their silence, even in defeat." "A troubling thought," Edmund said. "Do you suspect anyone in particular?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the silence itself became a kind of pressure in the room. "I suspect many people, Uncle," he said finally. "It comes with the title, I'm afraid. Not everyone believes I deserve to hold it." The words landed with precision, close enough to accusation to test Edmund's composure without crossing into anything he could openly object to. Claire watched a muscle tighten in Edmund's jaw, the first genuine crack she had seen in his practiced calm. "Surely you don't suspect me," Edmund said, forcing a laugh that did not quite land correctly. "I've supported this family my entire life." "Of course not," Julian said smoothly. "I only meant that ambition takes many forms, and I've learned to watch for it everywhere, even sometimes in places I'd rather not look." The conversation continued for another hour, circling carefully around the true subject without ever naming it directly. Each man testing the other's composure, searching for weaknesses without revealing his own. Claire contributed little, choosing instead to watch, filing away every small detail the way she had learned to do since childhood, until finally Edmund rose to leave, his warm smile firmly back in place despite whatever tension had passed beneath the surface of their conversation. "I do hope you'll consider additional protection for the manor," he said, pausing at the door. "A man in your condition, Julian, cannot be too careful." "I appreciate the concern," Julian said, truly. Once Edmund's carriage had disappeared down the long drive, Julian's careful mask fell away entirely, exhaustion and quiet fury replacing the tired performance he had maintained for the past hour. "He knows," Claire said, "or at least he suspects." "He suspects," Julian agreed. "The attack failing has told him something is different even if he can't yet prove what. He'll be more careful next time, more patient." "Then we need to be faster than his patience," Claire said. Julian looked at her, something considering in his expression, before nodding slowly. "Griggs has been gathering evidence for months," he said. "Financial records showing Edmund has been paying men whose only skill is violence. Letters exchanged with contacts who specialize in poison. It isn't enough yet to bring before the courts, but it's close." "How close?" "Close enough that a push in the right direction might finish it," Julian said. Over the following weeks, Claire threw herself into the effort alongside Julian and Griggs, her sharp attention to detail proving more useful than either man had initially expected. She noticed inconsistencies in shipping records that suggested payments disguised as trade goods. She recognized a name in one of Edmund's letters as belonging to a merchant her own father had once done business with, a man known throughout the county for dealing in substances no honest trade required. Piece by piece, the evidence built into something undeniable, and Claire found herself, somewhere in the slow accumulation of stolen hours spent poring over documents in the locked room, falling into an easy partnership with Julian that felt entirely different from the cold arrangement that had begun their marriage. He listened when she spoke. He trusted her judgment in ways her own father never had. And she, despite every reasonable instinct warning her against it, had begun to trust him in return. The evidence was finally presented to the Crown's own investigators nearly 2 months after the attack, delivered quietly through channels Griggs had spent years cultivating, ensuring that when the accusation finally came, it would arrive with enough weight behind it to matter. Edmund was arrested at his own estate on a gray autumn morning, protesting his innocence loudly enough that servants 2 houses down reportedly heard him. The evidence against him proved undeniable once properly examined, financial records and correspondence painting a clear and damning picture of a man who had spent 2 years attempting to murder his own nephew for the sake of a title he believed should have been his. Claire stood beside Julian in the entrance hall of Cairnmore Manor on the day the news arrived confirming Edmund's conviction, watching relief settle over her husband's face in a way she had never seen before, the careful control finally allowed to fully unwind. "It's over," Julian said quietly, as if he did not entirely believe it yet. "It's over," Claire agreed. He turned to look at her properly, something in his expression shifting into territory neither of them had fully acknowledged aloud until now. "You didn't have to help me," he said. "You could have stayed in your room every night, kept your distance, waited out this marriage as safely as possible." "I could have," Claire said, "but I've never been very good at staying out of things that matter." "No," Julian said, something warm creeping into his voice. "I've noticed." That evening, for the first time since their wedding night, Julian did not return to his own quarters after dinner. He remained instead in the small sitting room where they had spent so many nights poring over evidence and guard rotations, and Claire found herself, without any particular plan, sitting beside him rather than across from him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I never properly thanked you," Julian said quietly. "For the candlestick, for everything since." "You already thanked me," Claire said, "the night it happened." "I meant it more than once," he said. Claire looked at him for a long moment. This man she had been forced to marry under circumstances neither of them had chosen, who had lied to her within hours of meeting her, and told her the whole truth only when circumstance forced his hand, who had fought beside her in a dark hallway, and trusted her with secrets few others in his life had ever been allowed to know. "I suppose," she said slowly, "that this arrangement has turned out rather differently than either of us expected." "Rather differently," Julian agreed, "and I find rather better." Outside, the gardens of Cairnmore Manor settled into the quiet dark of an ordinary autumn evening. No guards straining for signs of danger, no locked doors hiding desperate meetings, no careful performances required for an audience that no longer posed any threat. Claire had been forced into this marriage believing she was walking into a house built entirely on pity and secrets, bound to a man broken by circumstances beyond his control. She understood now, sitting quietly beside him in the fading evening light, that she had married instead a man who had built an entire performance of weakness simply to survive, and that underneath it, he had been whole all along, waiting for someone patient enough and stubborn enough to see it. The wheelchair, she thought, watching Julian smile at something she had said, sat forgotten in a corner of the locked room now, gathering dust, no longer needed by either of them.